Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Log4j Lessons Learned. How do you prepare your company to respond to the next zero-day vulnerability? My name is Sonali Shah, and I'm the Chief Product Officer here at Invicti Security. And I'm joined today by Tony Perez, founder of Knock and CleanBrowsing. Tony, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role in the industry?
Sure. First, thank you so much for having me. I've been in tech for about 22 years with a specialty focus in application security for about the past 12. Similar to you, I'm on the defensive side, and I've spent most of those 12 years building technologies to mitigate attacks looking to exploit vulnerabilities, right? So it's a little bit different than the detection side. And then parallel to that, I've spent a lot of time focusing on building technologies to help organizations remediate post-compromise. So they've been compromised. We go in, we help remediate that process. In that process, I had a startup called Security that I sold to GoDaddy, ran their security product group for a while, and then I was a glutton for punishment and came back to the startup world with Knock. So that's what I'm doing these days.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Tony. It's a pleasure having you here today. So let's get right into the topic,
Sure.
which is Log4j, the
Mm.
early Christmas gift that Santa shared with the whole world at the end of last year. So as we all know, Log4j is a widely used open source library that enables logging for Java. And on December 10th, it was disclosed as having a vulnerability that could easily enable remote code execution. So today, a lot's already been written about this vulnerability, but I think it would be helpful for our audience if you just shared a quick overview of what it is, why it's so significant, before we get into the meat of the conversation on what enterprises and we as a security community should do about it.
Sure. So as you mentioned, the vulnerability, we talk a lot about Log4j, and it's actually specifically Log4j2 library. There's actually a Log4j1 that doesn't suffer from this. And it's actually, what's really interesting to individuals like myself is that it looks to abuse what I would call benign features. Like it's a benign feature in Log4j and in the Log4j library, and a feature called JNDI. And I don't know how much people know, but back in the day, before APIs, right, we would use things like JNDI to distribute objects through a distributed environment, and that's what made it kind of so interesting. And so these two benign features were married together to create this vulnerability. And this came because of the ability for the logging app component to call JNDI to consume a serialized object into the log. And there's a lot of, like I was talking to my buddy Daniel, he's like, oh, what a stupid feature, right? And we're like, well, at the time, it might have not been. At the time, it actually solved a problem and allowed us to do some interesting things with it. But as we've evolved as an industry, we've realized like, hey, there's a lot better ways to do these things. And so that's essentially what it is. And I won't get into the details, the mechanics of what's happening, but just know that there's something in Log4j library that abuses JNDI that allows you to consume an object, right? And then run it in whatever environment it is. Now, for analysts like myself and researchers, what's so interesting is that Log4j is so integral into things that we don't even know exists, right? Like it's just kind of, it's so pervasive, right? Like you can go into your environment and say, hey, yes, I have Log4j installed, but you could also say, hey, I have no idea if it's installed, and it actually might. And it actually peels back the layers and shares a little dirty secret, as I like to call it, of how we build as developers, where we don't build every single feature that exists in an application. In many instances, we go out and we look for something that might exist that might help us solve this problem. And so you may have an application in your environment that's using Log4j to do logging, right? Hey, user, think of a web app. I go and I log in user ID and password, and I use Log4j to capture user ID, password, and save it to my logs for recording, analysis, whatever. And so that is by far the things that's the trickiest as we start thinking about mitigation.
Right, right. No, you brought up an excellent point there that you can't protect what you don't even know you have, right? And that's what we've seen. People don't even, it's a component in a component. It's, multiple layers, as you said. And I think what is so scary about this attack is once somebody's in, there's so many things they could possibly do, right? I mean, if they want to make money, it depends on the motive. If you want to make money right away, you could do ransomware, right? And be, make money, in hours of, or days. Or if you're a state actor, you could just stay inside, stay hidden, and wait for the right moment to strike, right? So there's a lot of stuff I think that we're going to see over the next several months, in terms of what the bad actors are doing, and I think it's going to be huge, right?
Yeah, and
So
what's actually really interesting about that comment is that once you have remote code execution, right? And you guys are the vulnerability guys, but remote code execution is it's like the holy grail. You essentially can
yeah,
do whatever you want to do. And the last piece you mentioned was kind of interesting, which is, well, yes, I could have remote code execution, insert an object, pull it from my malicious server, do whatever I want in your environment. But what you should expect, and I think what we'll start seeing, is lateral movement, right?
yeah,
And you saw this in Equifax is a great example of this with the Apache Struts framework. The Apache Struts framework had an RCE in them. And what we saw attackers do is we went, and actually, when you look at like the after action of what happened there, attackers went in via remote code execution. They then laterally moved into the environment, found a bunch of sensitive information in the environment, found the keys, found the information for the databases, found 43 or 47 servers of databases, right? And then started to siphon that information out. There's nothing to stop an attacker from doing the same thing here. And so while we are already seeing organizations attack Minecraft, right? We're seeing state actors abuse Windows environments, things like that. We should assume hide and wait. Lateral movement,
yep,
hide, sit back, wait for the noise to die down, and then perform attacks. And we saw that with things like SolarWinds, right?
yep,
They deployed malware, we sat, they
done,
waited
right,
months and months and months, and
right,
then they took action.
yeah, yeah. All right, so we've talked about this is so pervasive, and the outcomes can be, quite serious. But companies aren't helpless, right? So, what do you recommend? What do you think the right mitigation steps are in response to this?
Okay, so when it comes when it comes to mitigation, and what I've used to tell organizations that I work with is the thing to save you in these instances is a pragmatic approach. And you get your pragmatic approach by leveraging something that exists. And that is why we have things like incident response frameworks and policies and governance programs to implement that, right? And and I'll get to why that's so important. And so when you have an incident response program, it takes the emotions out of the equation. Because when something like this happens, it always happens at 2 a.m. before Christmas, right?
Right.
Right. And so, like, your energy is up, you're frustrated, you're calling folks, you have executives calling you, trying to understand what's going on. You got emails, it's in the news. Am I going to get affected? Are my customers affected? Legal's worried about liability, right? There's all this stuff happening. And so, what you have to essentially do is you have to block all that noise out and say, hey, what does my incident response call for? And so, when you pull your incident response, I'll kind of go through a basic framework that, there's more mature documents on how to create this, but this is how we think about it, how we approach things. So the first thing we want to start with is, what do I know? Well, it's my known nodes. Well, I know that this is a Java-based vulnerability, right? Let's take Log4j, Log4Shell as an example. It's Java-based. And so the first question I would ask an organization, or that I should be asking myself, is, what Java exists in my environment? The most obvious is VMware. Do I have VMware deployed in my environment? If it is, then I need to be looking at their security advisories, understanding what patches are available, because you have to assume that VMware is a massive, massive target in the enterprise, right? And so, boom, that's the easiest. Boom, I've identified, hey, this is my exposure. But incident response is about identifying your total scope of the problem and then working backwards from there. And it's actually trying to answer two different questions, right? It's trying to answer like, hey, do I have the potential risk of this? And once you know the answer to that, then you're applying mitigation to that. And then the other question that we don't talk a lot about is, assuming that you're compromised. That's essentially a mindset, right? When it's something this pervasive, you have to assume that you've likely been popped. And the question needs to be, how do I prove that I have not been hacked? Right?
Right.
Work backwards. And so let's look at the first piece. So we started with the known knowns. We've said, hey, we know we have Java, we're applying it. But as we've mentioned a couple of times now, the pervasiveness, the dependencies of this are everywhere. And so the next question needs to be, where does it exist that I don't even know it exists, right? And so you're going to want to be looking at you're going to want to scan your environment, looking at your JVMs, looking at your jars, trying to understand if the class has been embedded within a module of something else, right? And there are some free tools available. I think Lunasec has a free tool that allows you to scan, but there's others as well. And then if you are a large enterprise with commercial detection solutions, you want to be looking to those vendors to see what they're doing. And I think they're mixing a combination of DAST and SCA to identify this. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, you guys are doing something around this, right?
Absolutely, Tony. In fact, getting these checks into our products was top priority as soon as we learned about the vulnerability. And unfortunately, it caused a lot of sleepless nights
I bet.
for our security and engineering teams. But this is what we do. We're an application security platform, and it's our responsibility to help our customers mitigate this solution. So our platform first identifies
Oh,
the external applications and APIs, and we identify the various components. And we scan leveraging our dynamic and interactive application security testing engines, as well as SCA, software composition analysis. So for us, the best way to help our customers is to quickly build in those checks so that they could use our products to identify if they had, if they were using this component. And the thing that is, I think, really important for what we do is that every time we scan, we update the list of technologies that a customer has. So if they scanned even like the day before, right, this vulnerability was disclosed, we would have known that they were using the component, but would have said it wasn't vulnerable. And then as soon as it comes out, we can proactively notify them because we know, right? We know their software bill of materials, and we can say, you were using this component, it's now out of date, or it's vulnerable to a new 0 day.
so that's actually beautiful, and the reason I say that is because it goes to the next piece of your incident response, right? So you've addressed the things that you know, you've
Right.
looked to understand the scope of the unknowns, and then the next step should be prioritization, right? Like, is something important? I used to joke all the time, like if everything's important, then nothing's important. The same applies here, right? Where just because you have log4j in your environment doesn't mean that the vulnerability exists. And so we have to figure out, like, hey, is it a true RCE potential, which I think you guys do through some of your proof-based scanning and things like that.
Right.
Is it going to get me to that high severity, or is it just information disclosure, right? And so in the world of security, like, if information disclosure is kind of here, RCE is kind of here, right? And so, like, depending where it falls in that scale will dictate,
Right.
like, is that an immediate thing? Do I need to address that right now? So now you have this prioritization. Now once you know what you have, what the scope is, what the potential threat exposure is, you know what the risk is, then you go through your actual mitigation of patching, whether that's applying a patch that's available, updating an application, updating the class directly. Maybe it's disabling JNDI because it's not necessary, whatever the case is. And then, of course, the very last piece of your mitigation strategy is of part one should be communication, right? So we all have stakeholders, whether that's the executive team, whether that's senior leadership, whether the application developers, whoever that may be. And then, of course, we can't forget our customers. If it's something that has the potential to have affected them, we need to communicate that with them. The second part of your incident response needs to be this piece that I was talking about around proving that you haven't been compromised. And this is a little bit trickier. This is essentially an act of doing forensics in your environment and saying, hey, if you identify that your threat landscape included this as a potential risk, then you have to assume that it might have been compromised and work backwards. Like, what's the login implemented? You're going through your SIM, looking at communication, looking to call JNDI, for instance, looking for outbound communication. DNS logs is a great resource for this. Your WAF is a great resource. Your IPS is a great resource. Any of these solutions that are logging information, you're going to kind of dive into them, see what's coming in, see what's going out. And if you see things going out, you have to assume attackers came in, and then you have to kind of figure out, what are my next steps? Now you want to look and say, hey, they got into this server. Was this server communicating with other servers? Were there new things introduced, host-based detection? Did something get introduced to this server that will essentially function as a Trojan of some sort, or some sort of rootkit or whatever? So depending on what you're finding, going to dictate next steps. And so that's how I would approach incident response, very pragmatically, very unemotionally, just kind of going through the steps. And that's why you have these things in
Yeah.
place.
And Tony, though, would you recommend that people actually go look back in time a couple of months back? Like, how do you recommend
Absolutely.
they look at it?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. So if you look at the timeline of this, right, this feature was actually introduced in 2013, right? It was only disclosed publicly early December, but there was already instances even earlier in December and even in November of people having this conversation. And so
Right.
at a minimum, I would start probably about 60 days from December 1st, right?
Yeah.
At a minimum. And if you get an inkling in that research of something having been called, you may want to see if you go a little bit further back. But what's really interesting about this is that, and an organization is going to struggle with this because some of them don't have good data retention. Some of them don't have good logging.
Exactly.
But what do we talk about in security, right? About ensuring logging is in place, ensuring you have visibility. Like, you can't secure the things you don't know exist, kind of thing, right?
Right.
And so this is going to be really interesting for organizations, how far back they go, and hopefully they have at least 60 to 90 days to kind of get a feel for what their potential risk exposure is.
Right. Right. You're talking about sort of almost going back to the basics, talking about basic, logging and security
Mhm.
incident response plans. And what we've seen with our customers is, um, you know, our customers, because they work with us for kind of continuously securing their applications, they are more sophisticated, I would say, than kind of the average enterprise. But what we've seen is the customers that have been able to react the fastest are those that already have the right people, process, and technologies in place, right? So just starting with people, organizations that were able to respond quickly were the ones that have a culture of security. And that starts from the top down. So whether it's board mandates or the management team saying that security is important, having that culture in place is super important. And looking at our customers, the ones that were able to respond best were those that had the cultures in place. They had security teams, they have security champions within development, and they had an incidents response plan in place. So that's the people side, but then also process and technologies is really important too, right? Like, what is your data retention kind of process? What technology do you use? In the software development lifecycle, are you doing application security testing? Are you continuously testing your code to make sure that you can catch new things? And then also, the other thing that's really important from a process and technology perspective is keeping abreast of your changing attack surface. So yeah, it's going back to those basics. Those customers that have done those fundamentals in terms of getting people and process technology right are the ones that have responded the fastest.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? For as many years as InfoSec's been around, IT's been around, it's the basics that have been talked about and implemented for years that always come back and save us, right? And things like defense in depth, the idea that security is layers, and it's like an onion and you're peeling back layers.
Mhm.
These things are so important. And defensive controls, right? Like, the landscape is evolving faster than any one organization by themselves can stay out of. I don't care who you are. I don't care how much money you're applying to the problem. It's just changing extremely fast. And sometimes offensive security guys will attack the defensive security guys in the sense of like, hey, Your IPS sucks. Your WAFA sucks. It can all be evaded. And defensive guys, we're not denying any of that. We're not, like, yes, like you can absolutely bypass some of these controls, but these controls can be so powerful for organizations. So you're talking about large enterprises that have people processing technologies that have these frameworks in place. Those organizations are a small fraction of the web. I used to talk about like, I don't know if you recall the DNC hack from a few years back.
Mhm.
That wasn't the enterprise that got hacked. That was a waterhole attack that somebody in the enterprise went to, had a rat deployed in their environment. When they went back on the network, it abused the network, right? And so like, that is how attacks work. That is the tactics, techniques, and procedures, the TTPs that attackers leverage to penetrate enterprise environments. And so these defensive controls that we deploy are all designed to give organizations a little bit more time to get their bearing. Log4j is a great example. So Log4j was one of those things that could be exploited remotely via the web through malicious payloads in queries, whether that's searches, logins, et cetera, anything that would log an event in the application. Application firewalls at the edge, regardless of who it was, had the ability to respond the minute this was released within minutes, if not hours. What organization out there was patching this vulnerability when a patch wasn't even available yet?
Right.
Right. And so it's not, we in the defensive side, we don't have the luxury of working in a world of absolutes. And security is not an absolute. And you talked about it, right? Security is a continuously evolving beast. And so organizations need to be looking at what defensive controls do they have in place. Another great example is network firewalls, network detection. We've been knocking them for a long time. They're obsolete. The network doesn't exist. All this other stuff, right?
Right.
Well, look at how JNDI works. Had an organization had network defenses in place, if you look at the LDAP, if you look at RMI, if you look at some of the protocols that were being used to communicate back and forth to JNDI servers, had somebody deployed network defensive controls and blocked the ports which these communication mechanisms leverage,
Yeah.
they would never have worked either. And so it's like it's layering, right,
Right.
of security, multiple controls that are all designed to work together to improve our overall security posture.
Right. Right. It makes a lot of sense. So, Tony, if we just zoom back, step back and look at the big picture, what should we as a technology community be doing to prevent these types of attacks in the future?
This is a tricky question, right? Because we have, to answer this question, we need to look at how we approach the world of dependencies and how we approach the supply chain, right? And we haven't talked too much about the supply chain here, but the supply chain is actually a really important piece because there is no, in my opinion, no silver bullet to addressing this problem. If you look at some of the big vulnerabilities that have come out, whether that was Heartbleed, whether that's the Struts framework, whether that was Shell Shock, even this Log4j, these vulnerabilities are attacking the core of what makes the web go hum, right? Like these are
Right.
the fabric of the web. You know what I mean? And as organizations, we're spending a lot of time to harden our networks, harden the applications that we're responsible for. But what do you start to do when the things being attacked are the things that aren't in our control, right? Like we depend on somebody building an operating system for us to use in our web environment or our
Right.
mobile environment or our desktop environment. Like, what do I do if Microsoft gets popped? What do I do if Linux gets popped? And so I think there's going to have to be a much bigger conversation. And I don't know if there's a good solution right now, but I think over the next 2 to 5 years, I think that there's going to have to be some form of consortium, some form of like federal involvement. Not that I want any of this,
Right.
but I don't see another way around it, right? Like open source
Yeah.
is the idea of free, available software. Anybody can do it. One good feature can be used a number of times across multiple applications. Like, how do we start to solve the supply chain problem? Like, there's the practical of, as organizations, we need to be having that conversation. We need to be understanding, what do we have? That's why you have things like the software bill of materials, or this basic idea of like,
Mm.
if I buy a product from Invicti, I want you to tell me everything that you're using. But
Yeah.
but I'll tell you right now, it'll be impossible for you to tell me every single class and module that isn't yours. You'll say, hey, I'm using this open source software, right? And then this open source software has thousands of other dependencies. So like an SBOM will only go so far, but it's starting to have this conversation and discussion of, what do we really have in our environment, right?
Yeah.
And who's really in control of all these pieces? That's
Right.
our organizational like responsibility. What are your
Right.
thoughts?
I mean, that's the beauty of open source is everyone can use it, right? It's free, but no one owns it really, right? No one is responsible for making sure that it is secure, right? And that's where we as a community have to come together. And I've got to say, Tony, there's been a lot of, we've had big breaches in the past, government's sort of gone in and out, but I feel like we're hearing more. I don't know if actually more is going to come of it, but we had even before this vulnerability was announced with the executive order from the White House calling for a software bill of materials. Last week there was that meeting at the White House where executives from Google, Amazon, Facebook, Oracle, Apple, all the big technology companies came together to meet with government officials and started talking about how we would have a public-private partnership, right, to manage this. Um, do you think it sounds to me it's almost like we need a UN for cybersecurity, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think a consortium of some sort, I think, is inevitable. But it's so complicated. I mean, like you said, you're crossing boundaries between public, private, government, uh, geopolitical, right? Multiple
Right,
jurisdictions, what governments want what. And so, what I likely find is what we're seeing now in the space of privacy. Privacy is probably a good example of this, where we had GDPR come out for the European Union. We had in the US, multiple states implementing privacy specific mandates. We still don't have a federal rule on it, but I think that's inevitable. And I think that vulnerabilities will likely take the same route. I think that privacy is probably paving the road or building the foundation for how we even begin to think about this. How do we think about data
that's a
breaches? How do we
great
think
point.
about privacy, et cetera? And so it's not going to move fast, right? And that's the problem. And I think that what we'll likely see on the private sector is um, we'll likely see more startups and more organizations deploying solutions to truly understand your attack surface, right? And
Right.
where your attack surface is looking at your entire supply chain, looking at your network, looking at all potential points of entry, et cetera. That's why it's become such a hot subject these days, is because things like this just kind of highlight, like, wow, we've done all this stuff to protect our environments, but we still have a lot of weaknesses in our environment. And here's a great example of something like, did you
It,
even know that this existed?
it's still Swiss cheese, right?
That's exactly
There's
right.
holes all over the place. Well, thank you, Tony. This has been, a great conversation. I think we've talked a lot about a lot of things. It's interesting. The year last year started with news about cyber attacks. It was, solar winds and election fraud, and ended with Log4j. And it's going to continue. We're going to continue to see these types of vulnerabilities. There's no clear solution, but I think one key takeaway I think for our audience is go back to the basics, right? Defense in depth, having the right people, process, and technologies, knowing your attack surface, and making sure that security is something that is always top of mind for your organization, right? These all apply for the latest Log4j vulnerability, and will apply to the next one as well. And in the meantime, hopefully over the next couple of years, we will see some progress in terms of public-private partnership to to do things that will actually do a better job protecting us. So before we take questions from the audience, Tony, any last words?
Um, no, only thing I guess what I would say is we've been down this road one or two times in the past few decades, right?
At
Like
least.
there's a playbook for this stuff, and so when these things come out, just take a beat. I used to tell organizations, take a breath, go back to the basics. We're going to be perfectly fine. And so I would leave it with that.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony. Now we will take a few questions from the audience. You can submit your questions via the Q&A function in the webinar console, and we'd be happy to take them.